In the winter of 1987, in a small wooden cabin outside Tomsk, Siberia, an 89-year-old man named Viktor Sokolov grabbed his grandson's hand with surprising strength. His eyes, clouded with age but suddenly sharp with urgency, locked onto the young man's face. Viktor had been dying for weeks, his body failing, his mind slipping in and out of coherence. But that night, something changed. He became lucid, focused, almost manic with the need to speak. What came out of his mouth over the next 3 hours would challenge everything we think we know about history, technology, and the true scale of human civilization. Viktor wasn't just any old man telling stories. He was the last surviving member of a specialized logging crew that operated in the Siberian wilderness between 1920 and 1935. A crew that wasn't cutting down ordinary trees. They were dismantling what Viktor called the old growth. Trees so massive, so geometrically perfect, so fundamentally wrong in their scale and construction that calling them trees felt like an insult to what they actually were. Viktor said they weren't trees at all. They were structures, constructs, remnants of something that existed before our version of history began. His grandson, Alexei, recorded the conversation on a cassette tape using an old Soviet-era recorder. That tape sat in a drawer for 30 years, moved from apartment to apartment, surviving the collapse of the USSR and the chaos that followed. Alexei couldn't bring himself to listen to it for decades. When he finally digitized it in 2017 and shared fragments on a Russian history forum, the response was immediate and terrifying. The tape disappeared from the internet within weeks. The forum thread was deleted, his account was banned, but not before researchers archived it. Not before people started asking questions that mainstream historians refused to answer. Not before the story escaped into the world where it could never be fully erased again. If you're finding this valuable, subscribe now. Next week, I'm revealing the classified Soviet documents that corroborate Viktor's story. Documents that were sealed until 2015 and then mysteriously reclassified. You won't find this anywhere else. Viktor Sokolov was born in 1898 in a logging village called Srednikolimsk, deep in the Sakha Republic of eastern Siberia. His father was a traditional logger who worked the taiga forests. His grandfather was a traditional logger before him. The family had been cutting timber for as long as anyone could remember, back through generations that disappeared into the mists of time before written records reached that remote corner of the world. But the trees they cut were normal. Pine, larch, birch, the hardy species that survive Siberian winters where temperatures dropped to 60 below zero. Trees you could wrap your arms around, trees that fell in predictable directions, trees that behaved like trees according to the laws of nature everyone understood. Viktor grew up learning the trade, starting at age 7 by hauling branches and learning to read the forest. By 15, he was felling trees himself. By 20, he was one of the best loggers in his village, known for his ability to judge exactly where a tree would fall and for his uncanny sense of when the ice on the rivers was thick enough to transport logs. His life was mapped out. He would marry a girl from a neighboring village. He would have sons. He would teach them the trade. The cycle would continue as it always had. In 1920, when Viktor was 22, everything changed. A government official arrived in his village, which was unusual in itself. Srednikolimsk was so remote that government representatives almost never came there. The revolution had happened 3 years earlier. The civil war was still raging in parts of Russia. But out in the deep Siberian wilderness, life continued much as it always had. The official arrived with an armed escort, which was the second unusual thing. He gathered the village's best loggers and made an unusual job offer. The Soviet government was launching an industrial expansion project. They needed timber, massive amounts of timber for construction, for railroad ties, for the building of the new socialist future, but not from the accessible forests near cities where hundreds of logging camps already operated. They needed timber from a specific region 400 kilometers north, in an area so remote it didn't appear on most maps, so isolated that even the nomadic Evenk people avoided it. The official called it the Tunguska Secondary Zone, adjacent to where the famous 1908 explosion had occurred, the mysterious blast that had flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest and lit up the night sky across Europe. Victor and 9 other men were selected based on their skill, their strength, and according to Victor, their lack of family ties that might ask too many questions. The pay was extraordinary, 3 times what a normal logger earned, plus bonuses that would set a man up for life if he completed the full contract term of 5 years. But there were conditions that should have set off warning bells in anyone's mind. They would work in total isolation, with no contact with the outside world except for supply deliveries every 3 months. They would sign documents promising never to discuss the operation with anyone, not family, not friends, not future employers. They would be accompanied at all times by 2 armed guards whose job, the official made clear, wasn't to protect the loggers from bears or bandits, but to ensure compliance with the secrecy protocols. And they would work under the direction of a government engineer who would supervise all operations and make all decisions about what could and could not be discussed, even among the crew themselves. Several men refused the offer immediately. Something felt wrong. But Victor, young and confident and hungry for the kind of money that could change his life, signed without hesitation. Looking back from his deathbed 67 years later, Victor told his grandson that signing that document was the moment his life split into 2 parts, before and after. Before, when the world made sense. After, when nothing would ever make sense again. The crew travelled north for 3 weeks through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, first by train to Krasnoyarsk, then by horse-drawn sledge deeper into the wilderness, finally on foot through snow that reached their waists and temperatures that froze exposed skin in minutes. They moved through forests that grew progressively stranger the further north they went. The trees became sparser but also older, more twisted, as if the forest itself was trying to warn them away from whatever lay ahead. When they finally arrived at the worksite on a grey January morning in 1921, Victor said his first reaction was confusion. They emerged from a tree line into a massive clearing that stretched for over 1 kilometre in every direction. The clearing itself was wrong, too perfect, too circular, as if something had carved it out of the forest with geometric precision rather than the random chaos of natural fire or storm damage. They were standing in this clearing surrounded by what Victor initially thought were cliffs or massive rock formations jutting up from the snow-covered ground. Then the engineer, a thin, nervous man in his 40s who hadn't spoken more than 12 words during the entire journey, pointed upward with a shaking hand. Victor followed his gesture and understood. These weren't cliffs. These weren't rock formations, these were tree trunks, or what remained of tree trunks. They had been cut, sawn through at roughly 15 meters above ground level, leaving massive stumps that rose like the pillars. A typical Siberian pine, a tree that has adapted to grow in one of the harshest climates on Earth, reaches maybe 30 or 40 meters tall over a lifespan of 200 to 300 years. Its trunk circumference at the base might be 2 to 3 meters if it's an exceptionally large specimen. These structures weren't 10 times larger. They weren't operating on the same scale at all. They existed in a category so far beyond normal botany that comparing them to trees was like comparing a rowboat to an aircraft carrier. But size wasn't the strangest part. Size alone might be explained away as some unknown species, some genetic anomaly, some freak of nature that existed in isolation before climate change or disease or whatever killed them off. No, what made these things fundamentally impossible was everything else about them. Victor described the bark as unusually smooth, almost polished, with a texture closer to worked stone than organic matter. Where normal tree bark is rough, fractured, full of the random chaos of biological growth, this bark had a pattern. A deliberate repeating pattern of interlocking hexagons, each hexagon about the size of a dinner plate, each one fitting perfectly against its neighbours with mathematical precision. The hexagons weren't carved or added. They were part of the structure itself, as if the tree had grown according to a blueprint, following rules that had nothing to do with how trees actually grow. When they finally cut through the outer bark on the first trunk, a process that took 4 full days of continuous work with industrial saws designed for the hardest woods, they discovered that the bark was over 1 meter thick in places. Beneath it, the interior wood was dense and dark, nothing like the pale, relatively soft wood of normal Siberian conifers. It was almost black in color, with a grain pattern so regular, so geometric that it looked manufactured. Victor said it reminded him of the cross-section of a steel beam more than anything organic. The rings, when they finally counted them on the first processed section, were spaced with mechanical precision. No variation for drought years or good years, no irregularities for injuries or disease, no response to environmental stress. Just perfect spacing, year after year after year, for what appeared to be thousands of rings. They counted 3,400 rings on one section before the engineer stopped them and ordered that particular measurement be excluded from the official records. If those rings actually represented years, it meant the structure had been growing for over 3 millennia, long before recorded Russian history, long before the Vikings, contemporaneous with ancient Egypt and Babylon. The engineer, whose name Victor never learned, took samples constantly with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He measured angles with precision instruments, took photographs with a large format camera that required a tripod and chemical treatments to develop, made detailed sketches in leather-bound notebooks that he kept locked in a metal case. He seemed particularly interested in the bark patterns, spending hours photographing them from different angles, measuring the dimensions of the hexagons, calculating ratios that he muttered to himself but never explained to anyone else. The crew worked in shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours in the tent camp they'd set up. Cutting these trees wasn't like cutting normal trees. Their tools, even the industrial saws brought specifically for this job, dulled almost immediately. They went through saw blades at a rate that seemed impossible. A blade that should last weeks was destroyed in hours. The wood didn't cut so much as fracture, breaking away in chunks rather than producing the sawdust you'd expect. It took them 6 weeks to fully process the first trunk. When it finally fell, the impact shook the ground so hard that Victor said he felt it in his teeth. The tree fell in slow motion, he said, like it was falling through water instead of air. When it hit, it didn't bounce or roll. It just settled into the snow with a sound he described as a deep, resonant hum that lasted for almost a minute after impact. Inside that first trunk, about 40 meters up from the base, they found something that made the engineer stop all work for 3 days. A cavity, not a natural hollow caused by rot or animal activity. A perfectly cylindrical cavity, about 2 meters in diameter, running vertically through the center of the trunk for at least 20 meters before the wood closed around it again. The walls of the cavity were smooth, unnaturally smooth, and they were warm to the touch, even though the tree had been dead for who knows how long, even though the outside temperature was 30 degrees, below zero. The engineer spent those 3 days inside the cavity with his instruments. Victor wasn't allowed inside, but he could hear the engineer talking to himself, taking notes, occasionally shouting something in excitement or frustration. When he finally emerged, he looked shaken. He ordered the guards to establish a wider perimeter. He told the crew that anything they found from this point forward, any unusual features or objects, were to be reported immediately before any work continued. They found more cavities, 7 more in that first trunk alone, each one perfectly cylindrical, each one running vertically through the wood, each one sealed at both ends by solid wood. In the third cavity, they found what Victor described as a metal framework. Not tools, not debris that had somehow gotten embedded. A structure, thin metal rods, each about as thick as a pencil, arranged in a lattice pattern inside the cavity. The rods were made of something that didn't rust, didn't tarnish, didn't corrode despite what must have been centuries or millennia of exposure to the elements through tiny cracks in the wood. The engineer carefully extracted one of the rods. It was surprisingly light for metal, with a dull grey surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He performed a simple test, striking it against a rock. The rod rang like a tuning fork, producing a clear, sustained tone that Victor said lasted for over a minute, barely fading. The engineer's hands were shaking as he wrapped it in cloth and placed it in a locked case he kept in his tent. Over the next 4 years, the crew processed 11 of these giant trunks. Not all of them contained cavities, but most did. And the cavities always contained something. Sometimes it was just that strange humming warmth. Sometimes it was metal frameworks. In 3 cases, they found what Victor described as crystalline formations, geometric structures made of a clear or slightly cloudy material that caught and refracted light in ways that seemed wrong, creating internal reflections that appeared to show depth, beyond what the physical size of the crystal should allow. The crew found bones in one trunk, not scattered bones like you'd find in an animal den. Arranged bones, a complete skeleton, human-sized but with proportions that were slightly off. The skull was too large, the ribcage was too deep, the leg bones were too long relative to the arms. The engineer photographed the skeleton from every angle, took measurements, then ordered the crew to rebury it immediately in a location he marked on his map, but wouldn't let anyone else record. They never discussed what they found. The engineer had made it clear that discussing the unusual features of the trees, even among themselves, was forbidden. The guards enforced this with increasing paranoia as the operation continued, but Victor said you could see it in everyone's eyes. The growing understanding that these weren't trees, these were something else, something built, something grown, something that existed before the forests we know, before the history we're taught, before the world was whatever it is now. In 1935, the operation ended abruptly. The crew had been working on the 12th trunk when new orders came from Moscow. All work was to stop immediately. All equipment was to be left in place. The crew was to return to civilization, sign new secrecy documents, and disperse to different regions of the Soviet Union. They were each given a substantial payment and a warning that discussing the operation with anyone, including family, would result in severe consequences. Victor never saw any of his crew members again. He tried to find them over the years, but it was as if they'd been erased. He returned to Tomsk, married, had children, worked as a regular carpenter. He never spoke about the operation to anyone until that winter night in 1987, when he knew death was close and decided the story mattered more than the consequences. But here's what makes Victor's story more than just a wild tale from a dying man. In 2015, when certain Soviet archives were briefly declassified before being sealed again, researchers found references to something called the Tunguska Timber Recovery Program. The documents were heavily redacted, but they confirmed that a logging operation took place in the region Victor described during the years he described, with the level of secrecy he described. More importantly, the documents referenced non-standard timber dimensions and structural anomalies requiring specialized extraction protocols. One document, a supply requisition from 1923, requested 400 replacement saw blades for a crew of 10 men over a 3-month period. That's 40 blades per man per month, or more than 1 blade per day. For perspective, a normal logging crew in that era would go through maybe 10 to 15 blades per man per year. Another document, a geological survey from 1931, makes reference to petrified forest remnants displaying hexagonal bark patterning consistent with artificial replication rather than organic growth. The survey recommended immediate cessation of public access to the region and suggested that any recovered materials be transferred to a facility in Novosibirsk for analysis. In 1998, a French expedition to the Tunguska region, ostensibly studying the 1908 explosion site, encountered a restricted zone they weren't expecting. Russian military personnel turned them back, citing environmental concerns. But one member of the expedition, before being detained, managed to photograph several massive stumps in a clearing. The photographs show stumps with circumferences that match Victor's descriptions, though the French team had no way of knowing about Victor's story at the time since the recording hadn't been released yet. The stumps in those photographs display the same hexagonal bark pattern Victor described, and in the center of the largest visible stump there's a clear cylindrical depression, just like the cavities Victor said they found inside the trunks. Mainstream historians dismiss stories like Victor's as folklore, misunderstandings, or fabrications. They argue that Siberia's forests, while containing some large specimens, don't and never did contain trees of the scale Victor describes. They point out that no biological mechanism could support a tree 180 meters tall with a trunk 47 meters around. The structural load alone would cause the tree to collapse under its own weight, but that argument assumes these structures were trees in the biological sense we understand. Victor never called them trees. He called them the old growth, a term his engineer boss used. And everything Victor described points to something that grew or was built according to principles we don't understand, in an era we've been taught never existed. The Tartaria hypothesis, for those unfamiliar, suggests that advanced global civilization existed relatively recently, perhaps as late as the 18th or early 19th century, and was deliberately erased from history. Proponents point to architectural anomalies, map discrepancies, and countless structures around the world that seem too sophisticated for the official timeline of human technological development. The giant trees of Siberia fit into this framework uncomfortably well. If Tartaria existed as an advanced civilization with technology beyond what we're told was possible for that era, then structures masquerading as natural formations make perfect sense. Not as trees, but as something else. Atmospheric processors, energy collectors, communications arrays, massive vertical structures serving purposes we can only guess at. The hexagonal bark pattern Victor described is particularly interesting. Hexagons are the most efficient packing shape in nature, but they're also a fundamental pattern in advanced material science and architectural design. The crystalline formations inside the cavities, the metal lattices, the warmth persisting in dead wood, these aren't characteristics of organic life. They're characteristics of technology. Some researchers have suggested these structures were artificial trees, massive constructs built to serve the same atmospheric and environmental functions as biological trees, but on a scale necessary for a civilization operating at global levels. Others propose they were remnants of some kind of planetary engineering project, structures designed to terraform or maintain environmental stability across vast regions. The most disturbing possibility is that these structures weren't built by any human civilization at all, that they predate humanity entirely, that we're living on the ruins of something so old and so incomprehensibly different from us that our entire understanding of Earth's history is a footnote in a story we can't even read. Victor died 3 days after making the recording. His grandson, Alexei, kept the tape secret for 30 years out of fear, out of uncertainty about what to do with it, and out of respect for his grandfather's warning that powerful people didn't want this story told. When he finally released fragments online in 2017, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Researchers wanted the full recording, skeptics wanted to debunk it, and within 2 weeks Alexei's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen except the original tape and all the backup copies he'd made. Alexei still has the story. He still remembers what his grandfather said. And he's not the only one. There are other grandsons, other granddaughters, other families whose elders whispered similar stories before dying. Stories about giant structures in remote places, stories about government crews dismantling things that shouldn't exist, stories about history that doesn't match the textbooks. In 2019, satellite imagery of the Tunguska region, publicly available through various mapping services, shows geometric patterns in the forest canopy that don't match natural growth. Circles, hexagons and straight lines cutting through wilderness that's supposed to be pristine and untouched. When researchers tried to access higher resolution imagery of these areas, they found that the most detailed views had been intentionally degraded or removed, replaced with older, lower quality images that show nothing unusual. The Russian government has consistently denied that any unusual logging operations took place in the Tunguska region during the Soviet era. They attribute stories like Victor's to Cold War propaganda or misunderstandings about normal industrial forestry projects. When pressed about the declassified documents from 2015, officials claim those documents were mistakenly released and contained errors that misrepresented routine operations. But errors don't explain the saw blade requisitions. Errors don't explain the geological surveys describing artificial replication. Errors don't explain why a region supposedly containing nothing of interest requires armed guards and restricted airspace to this day. The truth about the Siberian giants may be buried under decades of secrecy, literal tons of dirt used to cover the remaining stumps, and the deliberate destruction of evidence. But Victor's testimony, corroborated by fragments of documentation and physical evidence that slips through the cracks of official denial, suggests we're not being told the full story about Earth's past. These structures, whatever they were, existed. They were dismantled, and someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure we never ask questions about them. The last lumberjack who worked beside the giants is gone, but his warning remains. The world we think we know is built on the ruins of something else, something bigger, something we're not supposed to remember. And somewhere in Siberia, under the snow and the new growth forest, the remaining stumps are still there. still warm to the touch if the stories are true, still humming with whatever energy or purpose they were built to serve, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up and demand answers to questions we're not supposed to ask.